Welcome back to this special edition of the firm on international GAAR experiences. Now, the first GAAR litigation in Canada came some 7 years after GAAR was first enacted in that country. In Canada, a field officer is the first to determine if a transaction is to be subject to GAAR. His report is then sent to a head office that centralizes nationwide GAAR cases to ensure uniformity in application. A tax officer in the head office is the next level of scrutiny, and his decision to apply or not to apply GAAR is vetted by a 12-member GAAR panel that has the final say.
And this is where I was located, in head office. So I would get to see all these reports. And remember, it was pointed out earlier, 867 cases were presented to the GAAR committee. Thousands of cases that came into head office never made it. To give you an example, I could be working on 15, 20 cases in the head office on GAAR proposals by a field examiner, and I may only recommend that 1, 2, or 3 of them go to the GAAR committee, because the stopgap was at the head office. Now then, I didn't even have a final decision on whether GAAR applied then. I may make a recommendation if I determine that it didn't apply, and then my manager at that time disagreed with me because there was independence in the head office, is it would still go to the GAAR committee as well then. But just assume on the premise that I agreed with the field officer, and GAAR should apply. Then I would have to prepare a report. And every Wednesday afternoon, I would go present in front of a panelist of 12 senior officials at the Canada Revenue Agency, from rulings to Minister to Finance to interpret legislation to appeals to every specialty that particular transaction related to. For example, if it was a financing transaction, then we would have the person responsible at the Department of Finance dealing with debt. That person would be sitting on the GAAR committee. But you notice it's a broad group of people at the GAAR committee. It's not 1 or 2 or 3 people. It was a large group.
Approving panel for GAAR, that is a part of the decision-making process. The AO only has formed an opinion. He feels it is a fit case. Then his opinion or his belief gets filtered by the commissioner level officer. And when the matter goes to the approving panel, they are officers senior to the commissioner, and their whole-time, the panel consists of whole-time members. They don't have any other, this is the recommendation, they would not have any other job to do except to function as the approving panel. Then with DRP, there is not much of flexibility that if the workload is high, then we can set up another DRP. But for the panel, there is a provision that we will review the number of panels to be set up as and when the workload increases or decreases, as the case may be.
In Canada, the consequences of a GAAR invocation could range from a denial of that specific tax benefit that the transaction sought to a recharacterization of the transaction. In the US, it's a 40% penalty.
When ESD was formally put into the statute, I don't think taxpayers were significantly alarmed or concerned about it, but what was new about the provision was that there was this 40% penalty that now applied if the taxpayer's transaction was found not to have met the ESD, and there was tax that was underpaid as a result of that. So that aspect of it has given taxpayers some pause and has made them rethink whether or not certain transactions that they would have otherwise potentially undertaken and possibly contended with a challenge by the courts will now have to overcome this potential hurdle of, okay, what if I'm wrong? I'm going to have to pay this 40% penalty over and above my tax liability. So I think that has probably been the key impact, I would say, of the ESD.
In terms of the consequences of what would happen if GAAR is invoked, the Indian regulations the Indian law is very wide, and it gives powers to the revenue authorities which could enable them to do anything and everything virtually, meaning thereby that what they could do may be far too disproportionate and not commensurate with what has been probably alleged to be the tax avoidance motive.
The key concern here in India is, however moderate
GAAR is in design. It is the implementation, which is so subjective,
Right.
that is going to really bite. And I'm wondering what the experience has been in the U.S. ever since the ESD has come into force.
Again, the ESD, in my view, hasn't really changed the way the IRS or the field agents, if you will behave, in the sense that if prior to ESD being put into the statute, if an IRS agent were to come in, audit the taxpayers' filings, and if they raise this issue, it will work its way up the system, and if the position that the field officer took was unreasonable, he or she is going to be told pretty quickly that, no, this is not an issue that we're going to litigate through the courts. Let's not concern ourselves with this. Let's settle with the taxpayer. With the implementation of the ESD rules, I don't think that has altered or modified the IRS's behavior significantly, in my view, because they would again go through the same process or the same approach. So in my view, the concerns that Pranav has with respect to how Indian GAAR would be implemented is probably not as severe from a U.S. perspective.
All right, Professor Duff, we've spent some time today understanding how the Canadian revenue department looks at GAAR, examines cases, and takes them all the way up to the committee level, at which point a final decision is made. What do you make of the role that process has played in implementing GAAR in a fair or unfair manner in Canada and actually bringing more certainty to the taxpayer on what constitutes avoidance, because this is so subjective?
Right. No, I think there are a couple of things. One is what happens internally with the Revenue Department. Of course, we all live in rule of law countries where ultimately it's the courts that decide whether the rules apply or not. And so we have to remember that that's an important check on excessive applications of the GAAR. In Canada, there have been a number of internal processes, a committee, government committee that vets all decisions, and I presented some statistics about, something like 800 in the last, since the GAAR existed, something like 800 cases have been considered. Ultimately, the GAAR committee has tossed aside a number of them, and so it has played an important role of filtering and at least ensuring consistency across the country in the application of the GAAR. Interestingly enough, in the UK, in their GAAR proposal, they've actually suggested a quasi-independent committee, including people from private industry involved in the panel to decide whether a GAAR assessment would be made.
But the 12-member GAAR committee is entirely government officials.
Yes, in Canada it's entirely government.
Okay.
And in fact, there's a concern about having a quasi-independent committee decide whether the GAAR will apply, because in some sense it's taking away the power ultimately from the courts that should be deciding whether the GAAR applies.
In the 24 years of its existence, Canada's GAAR committee has examined 867 cases and applied GAAR 614 times. That's a 47% strike rate for the head office. Revenue's success rate has also been good in the 40 cases that reached court. 33% wins at the tax court level, over 50% at the Federal Court of Appeal, and 75% of the cases in the Supreme Court have gone in favor of revenue. You've experienced GAAR in Canada since 1988, so clearly you have a better ability to understand what other countries should or should not do. What do you recommend based on what you've seen of our draft guidelines of whether we're going down the right road or not and what we need to fix?
Well, I prefaced my comments earlier today saying it's always dangerous to make this kind of advice to a country that you don't know that well, you don't know the legal system as well, to make those kinds of recommendations. That said, we do come from a common English tradition legal system, share values around the rule of law.
And we have the benefit of experience.
And we have the benefit of experience. And I guess looking at the India GAAR proposal, those four factors that we've talked about do make me a little bit anxious. That in fact, I think one of the great innovations of the Canadian GAAR was to add this misuse and abuse test. And to my mind, the idea of tax avoidance, the hallmark of tax avoidance, is you're doing something contrary to what the legislation is intending. And so an abuse test gets at the essence of that. You're avoiding what was intended by the legislation. You're managing to get around it. And it's that abuse that I think a GAAR properly is designed to prevent. But a GAAR is not a broad brush tool to change all sorts of features of the tax system that you don't like. Instead, you should have detailed legislative amendments. If there are treaties that are causing a concern, renegotiate the treaties. Introduce limitation of benefits provisions. If there are rules about buybacks that are causing concern, well, there are rules, and we talked about that earlier today, in the U.S. and Canada that deem amounts to be dividends. And so that there are specific ways of dealing with specific problems. A GAAR is a residual, in my mind, is a residual rule. And it's a bit of a concern that it seems to me as though the Indian GAAR is potentially much broader than that, and is maybe attempting to accomplish other things.
Well, I know India would have preferred many SARs as opposed to one GAAR, but our last word to you, Pranay, on this. I think based on all the global experiences that we've discussed through the course of the day, what are the few things that you're hoping in the discussion process that will now take place regarding these draft guidelines will get fixed?
So I would feel 2-3 things very clearly. One, that if I'm doing something which is already envisaged in other provisions of the Act,
right,
then those should not be disturbed or get impacted by GAAR. So for example, if there's something like buyback, as David just mentioned, that's something that the Income Tax Act specifically deals with as to how it is to be taxed. The definition of dividend specifically excludes a buyback. There should not be a question then of GAAR being applied to recharacterize that buyback into a dividend when the Act itself categorically says that a buyback done in a certain manner will be excluded from the meaning of the term dividend. Things like that.
Alright, this is by no means a comprehensive review of the many GAAR experiences. We'd have loved to do China and South Africa, but this is all time will allow today. By the way, Dr. Shom, your team can also access many of these IFA presentations on our website. And a very interesting one by GE's Rupak Saha on how GAAR will change M&A in India. Thanks for watching this special.